Okay. In this first lecture, I will look at the historical significance of Lenin's life and work, with special reference to State and Revolution. State and Revolution remains one of the most important pieces of theoretical work that Lenin produced, and it's no accident that he generated it during the period of his exile in 1917, in the heat of Russia's revolution. Now, what does it mean to examine someone's historical significance? How do we measure this? In the bourgeois discourse of Western states, it's perennially fashionable to produce denunciatory biographies, and particularly there's a mini industry in producing denunciatory biographies of leading people from the Russian Revolution period, and Lenin in particular. It would be equally easy on the other side to be hagiographic about him too, and to treat his texts as sacred documents containing eternal truths. But I want to suggest that we need to assess the historical significance of Lenin in Marxist terms. Now, Marx understood his own science, what we call Marxism, as a historical product. It arose as a reflection in the form of thought of the contradictions within capitalism and the material emergence of the organized working class. Marxism and its concepts for Marx and Engels are valid science because they offer the possibility of revealing concealed tendencies and forces at work within capitalist reality, showing their interconnection and identifying the forces generating the possibility of progressive change. So for Marxists, I want to argue someone or some organization achieves historical significance to the extent to which they are able to analyze and understand the forces at work and the potentials and limits of their historical moment, and use this in self-conscious action that enables the further development of progressive forces at work independently of their will. Lenin's life and works, including State and Revolution, must be assessed, I think, in this way. What was the historical situation that in which Lenin wrote State and Revolution, and in which he was acting? What were the forces at work that he and other Marxists at the time were striving to understand? To what extent was Lenin able, through his political consciousness, expressed in texts like State and Revolution, to develop the progressive potentials of his moment? And to what extent can we still be guided by and learn from Lenin's work, including from State and Revolution? We need to start, therefore, by understanding the forces at work within the world in which Lenin was active. By the time Lenin was becoming politically active, the laws of motion of capitalism analyzed by Marx in Capital were working themselves out on a global scale. The concentration and centralization of capital was producing monopolies, trusts, and cartels in the advanced capitalist states of Europe and the USA. These were creating great new productive forces, harnessing new and old technologies on a larger scale, and creating, in the process, vast new organizations of socialized production, in which single centers of production could organize all stages of commodity production, utilizing thousands of workers in the producing of complex goods and services across the expanses of time and space. This social production formed the backbone of emerging proletariats across the developed capitalist world. Mass working class movements emerged across Western and Central Europe, armed with an organized political parties that were engaged in organizing economic and political class struggles within their states, committed, at least in theory, to a fundamental change in society towards socialism. As the capitalist monopolies forged a capitalist world market, they expanded across the globe, moving in search of cheaper resources, cheaper labor, and higher profits, exploiting the uneven development of capitalism, bringing non-capitalist countries and their peoples under their informal and increasingly formal sway. And the apparatus of the state, too, that Marx and Engels had analyzed, developed States became entangled with providing basic infrastructure to support monopolies, moderating the class struggles that emerged within nation states, and increasingly as monopolies expanded across the world, they sought the coercive power of their states in dividing and redividing the world into spheres of economic influence and increasingly of formal colonies. Now, Lenin was just one Marxist among many thousands who sought to try to understand and orient themselves in relation to these developments. The strategic question for Marxists was, where was this going, and what was the role of Marxist parties? Revisionists like the German Marxist Edward Bernstein argued that the emergence of powerful labour movements and political parties in the context of the extension of democratic rights indicated that the tendencies within capitalism were leading in the direction of socialism with little need for revolutionary action. Revolutionary socialists were divided over the imminence of revolution. Did capitalism need to complete itself everywhere before revolutionary action to advance socialism should be attempted? In which case, the task of Marxist parties was to ally themselves with the bourgeoisies to foster democratic revolutions against autocracies, for example. Now, for Lenin and a significant minority of German and Russian Marxists, they argued instead that with the growth of monopolies and their entanglement with the state, the growth of social production, socialist movements, imperialism and the drive to war, and so on, capitalism had reached a new phase called state monopoly capitalism, the final rung on the ladder towards socialism. This stage ushered in a new phase of heightened class struggle and anti-colonial or national struggles, which were presenting Marxists with the very real possibility of revolutionary political action to unleash the forces creating the potential for socialism growing up within the capitalist mode of production. And this is what the Hungarian Marxist Georg Lukács called Lenin's grasp of the actuality of the revolution, the level of development of productive forces and the relations of production, coupled with the uneven development of capitalism across the globe and the heightened class and national liberation struggles that flowed from these tendencies, meant that the material base of socialism was being forged within the capitalist mode of production, and at the same time that revolutionary outbreaks were a real and imminent prospect. The task of Marxists then was to analyse as concretely as possible the conditions in their countries and to develop revolutionary strategy on its basis to ensure that each section of the proletariat could play its part. For Lenin and the leading Bolsheviks, the weakness of Russian capital, its dependence on the Tsarist autocracy, the formation of a small but increasingly well-organized and militant proletariat, and the increasingly land-poor lower peasantry formed the basis in which it was possible to forge a revolutionary alliance that would be able to play its part in breaking the chain of capitalist rule at one of its weakest points and ushering in the process the era of proletarian political revolution. Now, the catastrophe of the First World War acted like a particle accelerator for the contradictions within the capitalist mode of production, and it also exploded the divisions among Marxists and socialists. For the majority of socialists and social democrats, the war was a disaster that essentially distracted the working class from its primary business of possessions and influence within their national states. In 1914, a succession of socialist parties of the Second International voted their government's war credits, including the powerful German Social Democrats. Even leading revolutionary Marxists like Karl Kautsky, who had fought against revisionist interpretations of Marxism, gave their tacit support to the war. For Lenin, the war was the defining issue of the time because it aggravated all the contradictions at work within capitalism and imperialism, and it turned the prospect of proletarian revolutionary outbreaks from a question of general historical imminence to one in which it was of immediate importance. As the war went on, Lenin argued, all the tendencies at work within the capitalist mode of production would be accelerated. The state would take over and rationalize more big business in the war effort, introducing greater planning and social production. As the suffering of workers and peasants increased, class struggles would be heightened, new revolutionary alliances would become possible, and the capitalist class would either have to turn the repressive apparatus of the state on them or buckle under the strain. And these developments would be accompanied, of course, by increased anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles. For Lenin, the Second International had sacrificed its right to lead the working class by supporting the war, and Marxists who understood this would have to build a new leadership that was capable of comprehending what was happening and of seizing the opportunities that history was presenting. Now, all of this would have been a footnote in the intellectual history of Marxist movements, however, had Lenin's analysis not reflected what was happening. But in February 1917, of course, he was vindicated. The weakness of Russian capitalism was exposed under the weight of spontaneous mass uprisings in the countryside and mass action in Petrograd and other industrial centers. The Tsarist regime collapsed and power passed to a fragile balance of a provisional government and the growing network of Soviets, of workers, soldiers, and peasants. And the question was, could the aspirations of the people for bread, peace, and land be fulfilled, or would the revolution collapse under counter-revolution? It was in this juncture between the two revolutions of 1917 that Lenin, exiled to escape the provisional government's repression, composed most of State and Revolution. And it was into this revolutionary ferment in October that he brought its analysis. So what does State and Revolution say, and what is its significance? In immediate terms, State and Revolution is an attempt to win the Bolsheviks to a new position in relation to the provisional government. And this was premised on Lenin's understanding of the actuality of the proletarian revolution. The time was approaching, Lenin argued, to end the dual power situation in Russia, in which the revolution's direction hangs on the balance between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet. The Bolsheviks must understand, Lenin argues, the essence of a revolution in order to act correctly. The essence of the revolution is the passage of state power from one class to another. It was not socialists in government, but the full seizure of the apparatus of the state in its entirety that determined the progress of the revolution. Failure to understand this would result inevitably in the collapse of the revolution into anarchy and a disastrous relapse into state monopoly capitalism under military dictatorship. The failure of socialists to understand the connection between imperialism, war, and the actuality of proletarian revolution was matched, Lenin argued, by a failure to understand the essence of the state and act accordingly. Bernstein had erased the issue of the state completely, while supposedly revolutionary Marxists like Plekhanov and Kautsky had dodged the question in practice. This theoretical failure generated political errors by the Mensheviks, for example, in their decision to support the provisional government. In essence, Lenin argued, most European and Russian Marxists had neglected the issue of state power for the very same reason that they'd supported the war. When the issue of revolutionary outbreak concretely arose, they proved to be paper Marxists, incapable of providing practical leadership. And this is why Lenin spent the early sections on state and revolution, tracing back over Marx and Engels' writings about the state. The state, Marx and Engels argued, was a special body that comes into being with the division of society into antagonistic classes under capitalism. This antagonism is what creates the need for special bodies of armed men, as Engels put it, supposedly above society, but in reality guaranteeing the everyday economic exploitation of the capitalist order. Over time, this state machinery becomes perfected, as Marx puts it, developing a bureaucracy, a standing army, and in many cases, a democratic republican shell through which the state projects its supposed independence. However, the state remains parasitic on the bourgeoisie through the networks of material ties that bind it to the existing order, while the form of the state, as a concentration of force and authority, presenting itself as above society and independent of interests, reinforces its ability to uphold the capitalist order. The form and the substance of the state are inextricably tied, Marx and Engels argued, to the capitalist mode of production. Now, the implication of this for revolutionaries, Lenin argues, is that the proletariat cannot govern through the existing democratic apparatus of the state while leaving the rest of it intact. Marx and Engels had correctly identified that the state must be seized as a whole, used against the capitalist class and to break its resistance, but also, critically, that its concentrated force must be dissolved back into society as the revolution progresses, so that it withers away. Now, in the critique of the Gotha program, Marx had argued that this transitional process between two modes of production had its own unique political form, which Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And in the Civil War in France, Marx began to argue that the Paris Commune was the material embodiment of the political form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And in State and Revolution, Lenin argues that revolutionaries must understand this distinctive phase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, properly, for this is the moment that is upon the Russian working class. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the political form of a key point in the social and economic class struggle. It is the appropriate political form for the stage where the ruling class is unable to rule in the old way, and the working class and its allies are unwilling to be ruled in the old way, where the working class becomes the leading force in society, and through the collapse in ruling class cohesion and the seizure of the state, is in a position to dictate the direction and the pace of change of society. That is the class essence of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The task of the dictatorship of the proletariat is to enact the processes that Marx describes in the critique of the Gotha program, the uprooting of the old relations of production, their replacement by new social relations of production, and the unleashing of the forces and relations of production that have grown up within the capitalist mode. Lenin argues throughout State and Revolution that the forms of the new socialist mode of production are growing up within state monopoly capitalism, being laid down by capitalist development itself, ready to be appropriated by the working class and their forces of production unleashed in the services of the people. In the concentrations of production, of banking, of administration, of communications and so on under state monopoly capitalism, we see social production awaiting the dictatorship of the proletariat. As Lenin memorably puts it, socialism is gazing at us from all the windows of modern capitalism. But the state's force is vital, not just for repressing capitalist resistance, but because it has the power to unleash the building of new socialist relations of production on the basis of those which are built up under capitalism. But because the state is a specifically bourgeois political form, the dictatorship of the proletariat must also have a distinctive political form. It must capture a dual need: the need to be a central apparatus capable of being used against the capitalist class, a concentrated force at the disposal of the proletariat in unleashing new social relations, but at the same time, it must be a state that is ceasing to be a state whose concentrated force is being dissolved steadily back into society. The first phase of this, corresponding to the phase of building socialism, Lenin describes repeatedly as a shattering of the state apparatus and a subjection of that apparatus to the people through its democratization. By democratization, he emphatically does not mean governance by universal suffrage and the norms of multi-party democracy. He means rather concrete democratization, the subjection of the organs of the state by different means to be determined concretely, not through appeals to abstracts, to the will of the people, The standing army must be shattered away from the state apparatus and democratized by being dissolved into an armed people. The day-to-day rule of central administration and bureaucracy must be dissolved by the rule of the Soviets and by the democratization of that administration, making it subject to elections and lowering wages to those of working people. The rule of parliamentary parties must be dissolved into the rule of elected committees based on the Soviets. All the organs of the state must be disorganized and placed in the hands of the people. And Lenin was clear that this would represent, on the one hand, a huge extension of democracy, but also it had to entail a coercive moment, the suppression of the exploiters, as he puts it, in State and Revolution, simultaneously with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the money bags. The dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force. And it's clear that that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there's violence. Now, once socialist relations are more developed, Lenin argues, the material basis begins to be laid on which the state can wither away. The era of state monopoly capitalism, he argues, creates the preconditions that enable all the people to take part in the administration of the state. Some of these preconditions are universal literacy, which has already been achieved in a number of the most advanced capitalist countries, and then the training and disciplining of millions of workers by the huge, complex, socialized apparatus of the postal service, railways, big factories, large-scale commerce, banking, etc., etc. During the dictatorship of the proletariat, then, the exploiters and the bureaucrats are simply removed. Through their experience of running, administering and organizing production, distribution, administration and so on, working people will put their factory discipline, as Lenin calls it, to the objective of administering the first phase of the transition to a new mode of production. As exploitation is abolished and recedes and the majority become involved in government and administration and its work becomes habitual, at this point the state is being dissolved into daily life, and this is the precondition for the withering away that Engels talked about. Now, the immediate significance of state and revolution is that it's a key part of the analysis that Lenin used to win the Bolsheviks to the need to seize the state apparatus in October 1917. In Russia, over the course of 1917, power was already passing from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. Strikes and mutinies occasioned state repression in the cities, while the military effort began to dissolve, and in the countryside, peasants rose in search of land. As the bourgeoisie melted away, power would either pass to the proletariat or back to the autocracy via a military coup or a dictatorship or imperialist repression from outside. Now, subsequently, even many bourgeois historians now recognize that Lenin was correct in his analysis of the political situation. There was no other option for Russia, no third way. The provisional government had already lost its mass base, and the alternative was reaction and dictatorship. The dictatorship of the proletariat was already coming into being in the popular power of the Soviets, many of the biggest ones and most strategically important ones with Bolshevik and left SR majorities. Many were already performing state functions. Sections of the countryside were already mobilized and self-governing. Large units of the army and the armed forces in Petrograd were loosened away from the state, from the military apparatus. The state was, to some extent, already being broken apart and subjected to fuller democracy, the democracy of the people. And in a sense, it was already, it only remained to place its political coercive force fully in the hands of the revolutionary people. And that's what happened in October 1917. Not a coup d'etat, but a political expression of something that was already happening throughout Russian society. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 brought the dictatorship of the proletariat into being, and it began to expropriate the capitalist class. a process that had begun in the winter of 1917 spontaneously and saw the full nationalization of key industries by June 1918. The coercive force of the state was used to crush internal opposition from whites and imperialist invaders, and the vast popular alliance between the working class and large sections of the peasantry held at least enough for the Reds to win the Civil War. There was, of course, no real withering away of the state. War communism, the new economic policy, the centralization of political power and capitalist encirclement all impeded further progress towards the kind of withering away that the long-term vision of state and revolution envisaged. And at the end of his life, Lenin fretted about bureaucratization. But nevertheless, the state continued to act as a general committee of the working class interest as a whole. Its apparatus was altered and to a degree subjected to mass organizations of the people. Parts of the state enjoyed mass participation and without doubt, as even dissident writers have recognized, enjoyed mass consent and legitimacy for a long time. Even if this was, as Lenin himself characterized it, a dictatorship of the proletariat of the harshest kind, that was nevertheless its class character. The revolutionary outbreak that Lenin expected in 1917 was weaker than he had hoped, and political revolutions were crushed in Berlin, Munich, Hungary, and northern Italy, though the issue looked in serious doubt for some time. And even in Britain, ruling classes had to take the actions of their working class movements into account, forbearing from more serious intervention in Soviet Russia, for example, for fear of igniting a revolutionary outbreak at home. Yet by 1919, it was becoming clear that socialist Russia had to survive and build socialist relations of production encircled by capitalist powers, committing it to breakneck industrialization in some form or another at some point in its near future. Lenin was not wrong in arguing that the proletarian revolution was an actuality, though its development assumed a different form from that he'd hoped for. The Soviet Union's dictatorship of the proletariat did create new socialist relations of production and unleashed productive forces that had a profound effect on the development of the capitalist mode of production and shaped the course of class struggles across the globe throughout the 20th century. It developed prodigious productive forces in terms of heavy industry, technology, industrial organization, and mass participation and commitment of working people, which not only transformed Soviet society, but enabled it to industrially outstrip and militarily defeat fascist Germany through an unprecedented mobilization of human, technological, and organizational resources. The cataclysmic war between 1939 and 1945 and the failed attempts by Nazi Germany to destroy world socialism once again accelerated class struggles and national liberation struggles within the imperialist world, and political revolutions took place across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, often with assistance from the Soviet Union. Even within the imperialist states, where revolutionary forces were defeated, the tendencies Lenin identified at work continued to develop to consolidate state monopoly capitalism, the last rung on the ladder before socialism. The state came to play an ever larger role in smoothing the course of capitalist crisis and restructuring. But it also remained subject to pressure from working classes, sections of whom identified positively with the USSR. And this was a permanent factor in ruling class decision-making and political struggles of all kinds. And that's a fact that I think has been acknowledged variously, not most famously by historians like Eric Hobsbawm, but also more recently by commentators from very different traditions, like Andrew Murray, and most recently even Guardian columnist Aditya Chakraborty. But what about now? So much of that world appears to have gone now. Can it really be said that socialism is gazing at us from the windows of modern capitalism? When the Soviet Union and the people's democracies of Eastern Europe, those early experiments in the dictatorship of the proletariat, have gone? Even now, I'd suggest, Lenin's thought, including state and revolution, has tremendous significance for us. The world that Lenin analyzed has not gone, though it's developed in ways we need to take account of. States and monopolies interlocked with finance capital still seek to divide and redivide the world's markets and resources. In the developed capitalist core states, they seek position and advantage through creating multinational operations, moving capital across borders, using transnational trade treaties. But the advanced capitalist states, above all the United States, still uses its military state apparatus as a coercive instrument of overseas imperialism against third world states and rising competitors like China. Monopolies organize social production globally on a scale far beyond that seen in Lenin's day. Multinationals control the organization of huge mining and primary production activities, manufacturing, assembly, distribution operations. They throw workers together in new organizations of social labor that encompass the North and the global South. But in the spirit of Lenin, we might look not just at the repressive potential of those organizations, but at the potential that they embody in terms of social production, the potential embodied by communication technology and the ability to organize production and distribution over time and vast spaces. And we might still see socialism gazing at us from the windows of modern capitalism. And we might also look at the social and political control of finance in China and the way that it's used not only to shield China's society from the kind of financialization that we've seen in Western advanced capitalist economies, but also to allocate huge resources to the development of social and economic infrastructure. As social labor is created across the globe, so the working class is bigger than ever now. Its traditional organizations may have become disorganized as it recomposes in advanced capitalist states, but it's growing and being thrown together by high rates of exploitation. Across the global South, or the third world, there are still an estimated 500 million peasant farms. In the era of neoliberal reform, these have suffered as the developmental states have withdrawn support and switched their resources to encouraging and supporting investment by multinational capital, often in capitalist agriculture, supplying the food wants of the wealthier North. As Indian Marxist Prabhat Patnaik has recently argued, for much of the global South, Lenin's concept of the revolutionary power of the alliance between workers and peasants is as live and as relevant as it ever was. And in the advanced capitalist world too, working classes can forge alliances with smaller capitalists. In every crisis in recent years, structural, financial, environmental, and epidemic, we can plainly see today, small and medium businesses are being put to the sword in their tens of thousands, while monopolies are shielded as too big to fail, enabled to restructure and to further entrench their economic dominance. And finally, the central lesson of Lenin's State and Revolution has lost little of its relevance. Nowhere has social democracy or varieties of socialisms that claim to respect liberal democratic norms and to distance themselves from Marxist parties, nowhere have these demonstrated a viable alternative route to socialism. The record of social democracy has largely been one of miserable failure. Arguably, even its small successes were gifted to it through a global shift in the balance of class forces that owed little to its own momentum. The difference between governing in a capitalist democracy and possessing state power has been demonstrated over and over again, with tragic consequences. The gains of social democratic governments made during the so-called golden age of post-war Europe were limited and rolled back. The bloody coup in Chile in 1973 and the succession of coups that have consumed the pink tide in Latin America have shown the price of an unwillingness to break with the confines of liberal democratic forms of government. No less than in Lenin's day do we see the need for the working class to take state power, to establish its own particular political form of rule, the dictatorship of the proletariat, through which it is able to lead and dictate the direction and pace of change, expropriating the capitalist class, unlocking the forms of social production and distribution growing up within capitalism. And just as Marx and Lenin learned from the great revolutionary upheavals of their time, and the Paris Commune in particular, so we have a vast wealth of experience now to learn from in our own time. For while it was rolled back, the socialist offensive lasted for decades and brought with it vast achievements, as well as terrible lessons in the challenges and problems that arise in revolutionary processes. As we can see all around us, the capitalist system is necrotic. Not only is it incapable of allowing the full development of human creative potential, for millions of people, it is incapable of sustaining even the most basic life or the prospect of a sustainable future for humanity. It is incapable of creating sustainable growth in the global economy. Productive investment stagnates, while wealth is piled into speculative finance that rocks the capitalist economy with ever bigger shockwaves. It cannot protect its poor, elderly, and sick from a global pandemic, nor can it prevent disease from throwing the economic system into chaos and recession. It is incapable of rectifying the appalling global inequalities that produce famine, misery, and death as an everyday reality for millions, while the super rich amass countless wealth and multinational turnovers dwarf those of entire nations in the global south. It cannot control its destruction of the environment or its degradation of our ecosystem. And as the rise of far-right political forces across the globe demonstrates, the ruling class are prepared to abandon the veneer of democracy and liberalism and embrace violent barbarism just as readily now as they did in the 1930s. We stand starkly once more before the choices of socialism and barbarism. Things are in motion everywhere. Things that were unthinkable just a few weeks ago are now contemplated by our ruling class, confronting their inability to control society and ensure the peaceful continuation of their exploitation. Socialists must analyze and understand the forces at work within our historical moment in all their complexity, if they are to play their role in enabling humanity to progress. Lenin's life and work in state and revolution in particular will continue to be vital parts of our living inheritance from the generations who struggled in the past. Thank you very much. I'm going to suggest that people take a break and join the people who are in Britain. I know there are people from other countries joining the call now, but I suggest that people who are from Britain take a break now and join the NHS and Key Workers Clap if they wish to, and we reconvene in 5 minutes. I'm going to just see what kind of a queue we have in terms of people wanting to raise their hands or ask a question, or what kind of chat we've got going on. We have a lot of comments. Sing the Internationale at 8. That was a nice suggestion. That's a good one. And what else have we got? I'm not seeing any immediate questions. Does anyone want to? I'm going to stop the recording now. There.